Hi everyone, I'm Shaham. This video is about understanding the FHIR element definition resource and looking at a few examples of it. So we'll take a look at the FHIR specification where this resource is documented. We'll walk through it briefly and we'll look at some examples of how that's used in other resources. This is just a introductory kind of level. We will not understand everything or spend a lot of time on any specific item. Okay, so let's look at let's look at the FHIR specification. The homepage for the specification is at the HL7 organization, so hl7.org/FHIR will take you to the homepage for the FHIR specification if you have not seen that before. So the first thing I'm going to jump to is the element definition. There are a couple of ways you could get to it. You could, from this page, go to this section, the conformance resource. I'm going to open that. But also the FHIR website in general has a very simple navigation pattern. So if you're at the base URL and just type the thing you're interested in, you will probably find it. So I could type elementDefinition.html like that, and you will get to it. The tab we opened up earlier, if you go to the conformance resource right here, it will take you to this page, conformance module, and you'll find element definition listed here. So if you click on that, it will take you to the same page. So this is what's called a FHIR resource. We'll talk about that more later in some other videos. It's considered a foundational resource, the element definition one. If you click on the foundation link, it will take you to the foundation module. It gives you an orientation of the foundation of FHIR, but we're not going to do that now. This page, we could call it the home page for element definition because there are other pages that describes other aspects of element definition. So if you're on this first tab, that is sort of the entry point, entry section or tab for element definition. So most FHIR pages that describe any kind of data structure resource are in this format. You'll have some text in the beginning. You'll have a table summarizing the structure of the resource with a lot of links to go to from here, and then additional details below it. So we're not going to cover too much of this. I just want to kind of highlight what element definition is based on what we looked at in the previous video. So an element definition gives you you'd specify a path in the element definition, which is the location of the field within the data structure that you're interested in. The path also gives you the name of the element that you're defining. So there is no other place to put a name for the field you're creating. The path, the last segment in the path, is the name of the field you're creating. You could specify how many times the field can be created in an instance that is using that field. And you could specify the data type. This is sort of basic kind of definition of fields. Like if you're familiar with programming languages, if you define a field in a class, you give it a name, you give it a type. There's a way usually to give it a cardinality if it's a list or something. It depends on what language you're using. But you could say a lot of other things about your element that you're defining. And this is a summary of the various things. And when you look down here, you'll see, so this is the wrapper. It's element definition. This is the type considered the class. So this is a class. The parent class is this one, backbone element. We'll talk about that later. But this is basically a class documentation, and this is a parent class, and you could jump to the parent class if you want to. This class, it's really a FHIR resource, has fields. The path field is a required field, one-to-one, which means you have to have one entry for the path within a element definition. You could give it a label if you want to have a human-friendly label. You could then give it the cardinality minimum and maximum. You could give it a type, like if you want to say it's a string or if it's a number or some other. There's a rich set of types in FHIR, and so forth. So you see there's a long list of fields within the element definition. That does not mean you have to use all of them, or it doesn't even mean you can use all of them. This is a collection of various metadata or various things that you can use to define fields based on the type of a field you're defining and where you're defining it. You cannot use all of them everywhere. The documentation sort of helps explain which ones are used when, but this is a very sort of low-level class, and you might have to look at examples to kind of follow as you learn FHIR. So there's a lot available here to help you define that single field that you're interested in. Define or redefine and constrain, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so I'm not going to walk through all this in detail, but what I'd like you to note is that this page, you'd want to read this. Don't worry about understanding everything, but this is critical to kind of start to understand what's on this page. The detailed description tab here is a more detailed description of every field in here. You could go to the page right here and read from top to bottom, or you could find a field you're interested in and click on it, and it will take you to a section in that page. So I'm going to click on the path field, and you will see it takes me to a section. It scrolls to it, but we're in the detailed description tab, but we're scrolled to the path field, and it's right here. And there is some narrative description usually, and there's some comments to clarify. The description, the definition that you see here, it's not always the same definition that you see in the home page, the front page for the resource. So it's worth reading both what you see here on the side right here, and then jumping to the field itself and reading the rest in here. There's almost always interesting information in here. Okay. So yeah, again, this is a type. It's a class. You would use it to create an instance of it. You would use some of the fields in here in the element definition to define the fields you are creating in some other class, another resource. So to look at the example, I want to walk through the patient resource. Okay, so if we go back, we're back at the home page for the FHIR specification. Okay, there is a long list of FHIR resources. If you're not familiar with FHIR, think of them as classes, the types, the data type, not the data types, the classes that you would use to create instances to hold your data. They're all listed in the resources tab right here. If you click on that, you will see there's a long list of types resources in here. But from the home page, we're going to go to the administration section and the patient resource. Click on that. We are now at a page. Again, it has the same look as the other one we looked at. This is the patient resource. Think of it, patient class, and it's the patient in healthcare. So a patient is modeled in this class. So you have identifier, you have names, gender, birth date, so forth, and contact information, photo, so forth. So this is FHIR's representation of patients. The core representation of what a patient is. Now, each one of these fields, even the nested ones, are a data element that was defined with an element definition that we're looking at. So you create an instance of the element definition to define each one of these fields. And all those definitions are put in a file, and that file has, in addition to the list of elements, that file has other metadata about the overall structure. And that whole file is an instance of what's called structure definition. So a structure definition class is used to define a structure. In this case, it's a patient. And within that structure definition, you start creating instances of element definition, and you put them in the structure definition, and that will build up your structure. So I'm not going to go into details of structure definition in this video, but I want to show you how you could find the element definitions for this patient resource. So in there are different ways to get to that. I'm going to show you the easiest way through a web browser. There is a place that I will later show where you could download all the content and have it all locally. But to get to that file that represents the structure definition, that has all the element definitions within it, you would take the same patient URL. So this is /patient HTML. But what we'll do is we'll edit it, say patient.profile, and then you pick if you want to look at XML or JSON. Okay, a JSON representation of the structure definition. So I'm going to do JSON. Hit enter. Now, depending on your browser, on Firefox, it might show you a JSON-friendly kind of view of this, and you might have to right-click on it and say go to source, where it's a view page source, and I'm going to do that anyway. In Chrome, it shows you the same JSON with line numbers if you open up the source. So you could look in here, or you could copy and paste this into an editor, a JSON-friendly editor to help you navigate. I'm going to just kind of look at it here. And actually, before we do that, I wanted to show you a simpler version of this. That one is a little bit too long. So a patient resource, like I said, if you think of it as a class, has a parent class called domain resource. Okay, so if you click on this link, it will take you to domain resource. This is a parent class for all resources in FHIR. Now, domain resource itself is also has a parent class called resource. So resource is a parent of domain resource. If I click on resource, we are at the resource page. This is a very kind of abstract high-level class. And resource class, or resource FHIR resource, does not have a parent. It has no parent type. So this is like the top class. If you're familiar with like Java, this is the object class. It has no parent. So this is where the hierarchy starts from for the FHIR resources, or the type system, you could think of it. So actually, this is the one I want to show you because this one is pretty simple. It has only 4 fields, which means it will have 4 data elements, element definitions. And it's just a little bit easier to walk through this one. So same thing, we'll come up to the URL, see it's /resource.html. I'm going to change this to profile.json, so because we want to look at the JSON version of this. And I'm going to open page source, and this is the JSON source. And I'm not going to copy and paste this into an editor, just going to do it here. You scroll down until you get to a line that's called differential. Okay, and what differential is and what the other fields, the top level fields in this file are, is related to what a structure definition is. So if you remember from last video, a JSON object starts with a curly braces, and if you need to mark the type of the object, the way FHIR does it is it gives a resource type field. Usually it's at the top. And this is a structure definition. So this file, this JSON object, is a structure definition. And it has a lot of information in that structure definition. One of the fields in that structure definition is called the differential. Okay, it's right here. The differential field is a object, okay, because that's curly braces. It holds an object. And within that object, there's a field called element. And that element is an array because you see a bracket here. And then within that array, each one of these, between one curly braces to the next kind of matching closing one, is an instance of an element definition. So there's one there, there's another one right here, down to here, and then there's another one right here, and then one more, and so forth. I mentioned there are 4 fields in that resource, and you'll notice there are 5 elements in here. The reason is because the definitions always start at the root. So if you count the root itself as an element, you'll have 5. You have a root element and 4 child elements of it. Okay. So Let's walk through an element definition. So this is an element definition right here, like I said. It has a path because it's required. The ID is just a unique identifier for this instance, and if you look at examples, you'll notice it almost always matches the path, or it's the path plus some additional characters with it. That's just a pattern. It's not a requirement. It's a pattern. That's how the specification creates IDs for their various elements. Okay, so this path is about resource. If you come down here, this path is about resource.id. So it's about the ID field within resource. If you come down to the next one, this is resource.meta. So it's the meta field within resource, and so forth. So each entry adds a path entry. Each data element, each element definition includes a path that builds the structure of the resource root element, and it adds a field in it. Okay, so that's the path. It gives it a short description, so you could put a definition in there about what this element is, and then you have the minimum and maximum cardinality, how many times this field could appear. Now this might be a little bit confusing at the root element. It's just basically saying resource can appear 0 to many times in other places. So don't worry about that one. But the ID field, for example, within resource, so resource.id could appear 0 or 1 times. So it's an optional field with a maximum of 1 instance of that field within the resource instance. The meta field is, again, 0 to 1. So that's the cardinality. The type field within the element definition right here, or the ID field, the type is given, the type of this element given by the type field and the code field within the type field. Okay, so this from here to here is defining the type of the ID field. This one, actually. Okay, so ignore the extension stuff, just focus on the code right here. And what you could see here, it's basically saying it's a string. Okay, and system, it means it's like a primitive built-in system data type. It's a string. So the ID field is a string. The meta field, so the path is right here. The meta field is not a string. Its type is code meta. And meta is a data type in the FHIR specification. And that data type itself has its own fields. And so forth. Okay, so don't look at some of the things that are not clear what they mean. On the other hand, if you're curious, for example, on what this binding thing means, for example, right here. So this is an element definition from here down to here. Down to here. This is defining the language field. Okay, and it's saying it says it's 0 to 1 cardinality. It's a code data type, so code, which this is the data type. There's a data type in FHIR called code with a small c. And then there is this thing called binding. So as you look through these examples in any kind of .profile.json that you're interested in exploring in the FHIR spec, take that field name and then just go to the element definition. So binding, and do a search and go down the list here. You'll find the field binding right here. And if you read what binding is, it says it's a value set details if this is coded. Now that's very vague, but if you click maybe a little bit here, you'll have a little bit more information here. And the definition says binds to a value set if this element is coded, and blah, blah, blah. This is FHIR specific information. We'll get to it later. But basically, you could come here and try to read the documentation. It's not always very friendly because this stuff is meant for folks developing FHIR, and there's assumption that you have some kind of intuitive understanding of some stuff by experience and by looking at examples. The documentation is not necessarily from scratch. for the core foundational resources. But that's the point of this channel that I'm creating, is try to kind of introduce this in a little bit slightly friendlier way. Okay, so now if you go back to, so we were at, remember, we started at a resource, and we walked through to here, the patient, okay? So if we come back to the patient resource, you'll notice the first line along the line where it specifies the parent type. Here it specifies the various inherited fields from that parent, and that's kind of all the way up to the top parent. So we saw the ID field, we saw the meta field, we saw the language field in the top parent of the resources. The other fields that you see here in this table are fields that are added to create the patient resource. So all the fields from domain resource are inherited, and then the ones are added in the patient profile to create the rest. And that's what that differential really means. Differential is what's added regardless of what's inherited from the parent. There's another field in that structure definition that holds everything from the top parent all the way down. But the differential just talks about what's added. So keep in mind here, so patient, the first field that you notice on the table is identifier. So the order of fields here is important. The definition and the differential field, where you start adding element definitions, dictates the order of the display of the fields in here. The fields are ordered in FHIR. If you try to do something with fields out of order, you'll get an error message, and we'll get into that more. So let's look at, remember, identifier is the first field you see in this table under patient. So we're going to go to patient profile.json. This is a patient profile. This is a much longer one. So look for the differential field right here. And if we, let's see, if we open this in source and look again for differential. Okay, so this is about line 1925. If you have line numbers in your editor. And you'll see the first element usually, although I don't think it's required with the newer tooling and newer versions of FHIR, but usually you'll see the first element is basically referring to the root. In this case, it's patient. So you start out saying, within the patient element, the root element, I want to add an identifier. So you put a path, patient identifier. So this is a data element instance right here, from here all the way down to here. This is a data element instance that is adding an identifier field within the patient parent element, parent class, context, whatever, object, whatever you might think of it. And it gives it a short definition, a longer definition, so forth. There is the minimum maximum. So patient could have 0 to many identifiers, and the type is identifier with a capital I. That's a specific data type in FHIR. So basically saying, take that data type, create an instance of that data type, and then you could add it to the list or the array of identifiers for a patient. Okay, so I think I'll stop here. The point here was to briefly show you what the FHIR element definition resource is, and you have a link to go there. Let me bring up the slides again. And we looked at some examples of instances of the element definition in the various .profile.json or .profile.xml files for a specific FHIR resource you're interested in. And the element definition is really important to understand, because as you'll see later when we get to what's called profiling, and I'll explain what profiling means. For most people doing profiling, it means taking an element definition that was already made about a resource in the FHIR specification and saying more about it. So that's what profiling is, saying, constraining it, which is basically changing the element definition. So you're redefining the same element that already exists in the specification. So knowing how to get to the element definition, the original element definition that you need to redefine in your profile is important. And knowing how to find it and knowing how to understand it is really a critical skill. So as homework, I'd like you, if you're going to continue with this, to read the element definition page, understand as much of it as you can, and then go and find few resources you're interested in, pull up their profile page, scroll down to the differential element, and then just start walking through the instances of the element definitions and by the path. And so you have that JSON file, you'll finding those element definitions. You'll see how they match the HTML page. The HTML page is created from all this information that's in this overall file that has the element definitions in it. And by the way, that file was called structure definition, and I'll talk about that in another video. So yeah, spend some time exploring and reading the specification for the element definition. And I will talk about the structure definition piece of this in a following video. So that's it for this video. Please like and subscribe if you find these videos useful. It will encourage me to keep going, and leave a comment. Let me know what you're interested in next, and if there's anything I could do to improve the content or the quality of these videos. Also, at some point, check out some of these resources listed here. They're still work in progress, and I will have a follow-up video to describe them. Keep in mind that this content is for educational purposes. There are no guarantees of accuracy and completeness, and you should use at your own risk. You might be seeing a few YouTube cards on the screen. They are suggested next videos or related playlists.